It's time to kill us some birds. Are you ready to go hunting? All right, then let's learn some game dev together. So the goal of this video is to set up our bird so that when we collide with a spike, we die, the world pauses, and the game restarts after a few seconds. Now, we're also going to set up a collision with an invisible barrier in our game, because right now we can actually just slide right through the world, which is not super ideal. So if I bring up the game we're on right now, and I come in between these spikes, well, we can just vanish off the face of the earth, which is no good. So that's what we're going to tackle first. So open up the project, and what we're going to do is create a new object. I'm going to go to Create Object, and I'm going to call this OBJ Barrier. Now, because we're actually going to have multiple objects here that we are, well, the barrier and the spike that are obstacles in our game, I'm going to go ahead and create a new group and call it Obstacles. So I'm going to place the barrier and the spike inside of here. So we just want to stay organized, that way we know where things are, and if you ever wanted to add more obstacles into your game, well, you can do that really easily. So in barrier, I'm going to click this button right here. This is the new sprite button. So I'm going to click this, and it creates a new sprite for us. I'm going to call this SPR barrier, and then I'm going to double click. I'm going to find a nice bright red color, press F for fill, and just fill it in. And that's all we have to do, just one click. Now, make sure your origin is middle center, although on this one it's not that big of a deal. And we're going to come down because it creates the sprite outside of all of the groups, which I think is kind of a silly default. It should be made in the sprites at the very least, but it is what it is. So now we have an object barrier, but we don't need to put any code in here because we're actually going to tackle all of that code inside of the Cyclops object. Instead, what we're going to do is go into our room and we're going to add a new layer. I'm going to click on the button right here. This is new layer, new instances layer. And I'm going to press F2 to rename this, or you can right click, rename. And I'm going to call this barrier. Now, there's a reason we're making a new instance layer here, and I'll show you that in just a second. I'm going to grab the barrier object and put it in our level. Now, we could drag this object all the way over here to fill this up, and I think that actually looks pretty good, and it makes a lot of sense because if we go down outside of the world or we touch the ground, then we die. But remember that this game, the bird doesn't actually move. It only goes up and down, which means that we only realistically need this barrier right here. Now, visually, from a designer standpoint, that looks a little funky, so I'm actually just going to keep it large like this. But in our game, we don't want to see this barrier. We want it to be invisible, and right now, it is very much visible. But that's why we made a new instance layer here. This little eye can make a layer vanish. So now this is gone. Pretty cool. Now in our object, there's a checkbox right here called visible. So it'll do the exact same thing, except when we run our game now, it will be invisible just like that. The difference here is that I want it to be invisible in the room editor itself. So when I'm designing a large room like this, I know I need some barriers in here, but I would like to be able to take them off so that I can actually still get a feeling for the room. Otherwise, it covers it up. So we can leave visible checked or unchecked. It doesn't matter. But I would encourage you to create an instance layer for each of your separation of objects. So we have our barrier. We should also have a spikes layer. That would be pretty useful. But right now, we don't, and that's okay. But this is kind of how we can create objects, have their code still run, but be invisible while the game is going and while we're editing the level as well. So let's go back into our workspace, and I'm going to open up OBJ Cyclops. So right now, if we open up our spike collision event, we call game restart. And this kind of works, but what we are adding is a way for the player to get some feedback when they die. Right now, it just happens instantly. You collide, you die, you restart, and that's all there is to it. Which, in a really fast-paced game, that might be all you want. But there are also times you want a little bit of breathing room. Maybe not Dark Souls-esque, where the screen fades to black, it tells you you die, and about 35 minutes later the game has loaded. That's a little excessive. But if we take 2 seconds for the bird to fall down, and later on we'll be able to play a sound effect, return to the main menu, we can do that. I think that's okay. So we're going to, instead of saying game restart, we're actually going to say instance underscore destroy. And then we're going to add another event with the barrier we just created. So let's find that. Now you can see here that we've got the collision event, the objects groups, the obstacles group, and then finally the barrier object. So it can start to get a little deep in the hierarchy when you start adding multiple groups. I think that this is worth it because even though it's a little more complex and might take an extra second to find your object in here, finding it in your actual asset panel, your asset browser, is significantly faster and you've grouped things together. That's definitely worth the trade-off. So that's just my little spiel on that. So with this event, I'm going to call this death. I'm actually going to rename the spike description up here death as well. And we're going to call instance destroy here too. Now, this is not enough for us to run this, because if we do this, we just kill the bird and then the game will continue running forever. But the nice thing is GameMaker has an event that will run when an object is destroyed. And you've probably seen it when we go to add event. There's a create event, which we use, and a destroy event right underneath it. We're going to add that right now. And I'm going to say create a dead bird. So anytime we destroy an object, if it has a destroy event, this code will run, which means that we can have as many obstacles, barriers, other things that kill us, and all we have to do is say instance destroy, and we'll be able to have the exact same effect happen because the code is running in the destroy event itself. Really, really handy. Now, we're going to say instance create layer. So we're going to create a dead bird version of ourselves. But we don't actually have that dead bird yet. So let's pause here and create that. I'm going to go to objects, and I'm going to create a new object. This one's going to be called obj dead Cyclops. And we already have the sprite for this, so I'm going to grab the dead bird sprite and drag it over here. And because we've got multiple objects here in our objects panel, I'm going to go ahead and make another group and call this player. I'm going to drag both of these Cyclopses into, not the obstacles, the player. There we go. And so that's where they will now live. So now we have the object. Let's go back to our obj Cyclops, our player object. And where do we want to create this? Well, we need an X and a Y location. When we make this dead bird, we're going to create it exactly where we are. So that is our X and Y position. Wherever we're at in the world, this is where it will get created. So that's totally fine. Then we need to make it on a layer. We'll create it on the instances layer. No problem there. And the object, well, we just made it, so we should know what that is. obj dead Cyclops. There we go. Now, what I would like to do is create a kind of effect like we press the space bar when we die. So essentially we collide with a spike, with a barrier, whatever it is, and then the bird pops up, and then it falls down, and when it's all the way outside of the room, our game will restart. So to do that, we need to have the same kind of system that we've got with our step event right here. So what I'm going to do is actually copy this event, go into the dead Cyclops, and I'm going to paste that event. Pretty cool, right? So we have code that we can grab from one, put in another. So let's go back to our Cyclops and go to our create event. And we're going to need pretty much all of these, except for our jump height, because we're not going to have the dead bird be able to jump when we press spacebar, so that's kind of a wasted variable. But we do need to remember to resize our sprite, because our dead bird sprite is 1180 by 892, which is larger, well, not larger than our room, but pretty close to the size of the room there. So it's huge. So we need to scale it down. So I'm going to copy the create event, and I'm going to paste it into the dead Cyclops. I'm going to delete this jump height variable, and there we go. So we haven't done everything yet, but if we play this and we collide, we die, and it looks pretty good. Now we're not jumping up yet, and the world is still moving, but we're going to tackle these one at a time. So first, in the Cyclops Destroy event, we need to set the dead bird's Y speed when we die. So we know how to do this by saying var, creating a local variable, setting it equal to the ID of what we get back when we create this. Just like we were doing with the spikes, this is the ID of what we just created. And we're going to say dead bird dot Y speed equals -8. So that gives us the ability to basically make it jump, and then it will fall. So let's give that a try. We collide, we jump up, perfect. Now we're going to tackle the game restart. So there's a really nice event inside of GameMaker under Other, and it's called Outside Room. This event will trigger one time when you leave the boundaries of the room. So I'm going to add this. And here is where we say restart. So when this is true, we're going to say game restart. Voila. Now if we run this and we hit this, as soon as we're all the way out, then the game restarts. Now, there is one more minor problem that we're going to take care of before we get to the layers and stopping the spikes. And that is, we can actually go all the way up here and nothing is happening. The reason for that is there's no barrier up top. So I'm going to make this layer visible one more time and go into our obstacles, and I'm going to place one of these barriers up here. And I'll drag it all the way here to visually indicate that you are not allowed to go up too much. Now, depending on how you want this to work, you could actually put it like halfway up here. I'm going to put it all the way up here just so that they know as soon as you go up, you're dead. The problem you might run into is if you do this, well, the code we've got right now is if you go outside of the room, then the game restarts. So if we go like that, our bird actually jumps up when it dies, and it jumps up just enough that it restarts the level, or restarts the game, faster than what we actually want. So this game restart, we need to qualify this with an if statement. So I'm going to say if our y is greater than room height, and then I'll wrap the game restart inside of here. So I'll do this again, and I'll show this. So if our y is greater than room height is going to return 1080 because right over here we've set the height of our room. And our y it increases as we go down, decreases as we go up. So if we are outside of the room above it, our y is actually going to be like a -20 or something. And so this will not trigger. When we are below the room, it will trigger. So if I go like this, I die, and it doesn't happen until I'm all the way outside of the room. And that's exactly what we're looking for. Room height is a built-in variable that GameMaker records the height and width of the room, and it's super useful to have. Now, I'm going to bring mine down just because I think it looks and feels better. Totally up to you as a design decision, but I will make sure we make that barrier layer invisible. So we've created a death for our bird, and I think it looks pretty nice. The last thing we need to do is stop the rest of the world from moving. So there are two things to tackle here. One is the spikes, and the second is the background. let's tackle the spikes first. So in the create event of the dead bird, this is where we can stop everything, because we can just call it once to basically say set all of your speeds to 0 to stop moving. Now, everything we've done so far has been accessing specific instances. So the spike manager, we save the spike that we just made, just like that. The Cyclops, the one that we create the dead bird on, we save the ID of that instance, and then we do something with it. And that's the most common occurrence, in my opinion. It's what I do the most when I am making my games. But in this case, we actually don't want to affect an instance of spikes, because otherwise we'd have to go through every single one to stop it. We actually want to stop all of them at once. And what's really handy is we can just access the object instead of the instance here. And the object will affect every single instance. So we can say obj spike dot, and then we can tell it to stop moving. Now, how do we tell it to stop moving? Let's jump into obj spike and take a look. Right now, it is hard-coded to move from right to left. We did this early on when we were trying to keep things simple, but sometimes simplicity actually causes problems, because now we can't actually tell it to stop moving because it's always moving by the number 3.5. Instead, we need to replace this number with a variable that then we can set to 0 when we die. So I'm going to say the variable will be called x speed, just like how we have y speed. Now, x speed is nowhere set, so this warning tells us it's only been referenced once, which means we need to add a create event. And I'll rename this to data. And all I'm going to do is set x speed equal to 3.5. So just like with our jumping, we have a y speed that we alter and can control, and it controls when we actually move. In this case, it's just one line of code, and it's always going to move by that same speed. But this will also allow us to increase the speed of this as we add difficulty options later on in the game. So hard-coded numbers can be useful for very simple projects, or when you're absolutely certain you will never change them. Otherwise, create a variable, that way you can access it and alter it later on. Now let's go back to our dead Cyclops. So obj spike dot x speed equals 0. And if we run that, now our spikes will stop as soon as we die. And it looks super weird because the rest of the world continues on. But the spikes stop, and that's what we want to do. Now we want to stop the background. And what's really nice here is there is a function to stop each of the backgrounds that we have inside of our room. So I'm going to go into our room just to bring up the sidebar over here. You can also click on these arrows to minimize and maximize this. And the function we want is called layer h speed. And it takes two arguments. It takes the ID of the layer and the speed you want to set it at. Now, you remember when we renamed these background layers to be much more useful and visually, understandable? Well, this is why we did it. So now we can go through just one at a time, and I'm going to start at the top. So I'm going to say ground is now at speed 0. And we can go through and stop every single background layer that's moving. So I'm going to copy this and paste it 1, 2, 3, 4 times, because we have 5 layers altogether and we already wrote 1. And I'm going to just type these in. So trees, mountain, clouds, and sky. Each one of them I'm just setting to 0, so it will stop moving. Let's press F5 and try it out. So if we do this now and we die, everything stops except the mountains, which we can see in the background there. So that's not super ideal because I made a typo. So when we create something and we mistype the layer name, it throws an error and it will just crash. But in this case, if we mistype it and we say mountain instead of mountains with an S, it doesn't crash. It tries to do it, it can't, and then GameMaker just continues on its lovely way. So make sure you spell each layer properly, otherwise it won't work. And if we try this again, we'll have the background layer stopped and working exactly how we would expect. So we do that, voila. Now there is one tiny little thing that we need to do still, which I'll see if I can make it come in here. There we go. You see how there's still spikes moving? Well, what's up with that? We set every single spike to stop moving. That part is true. But what we forgot to do was destroy the spike manager. It is continually creating new ones. So we need to stop that. I'm going to say instance underscore destroy. And now we can actually pass in an ID here. We could always pass in an ID. We just didn't need to. But in this case, we want to destroy not ourselves, but obj spike manager. And if we run this, we now have a paused world for our bird to die gracefully in. So let's give that a try. Voila. Nothing's coming up. I don't see any spikes moving. It looks really good. I'll wait until that one. And there we go. That's exactly what we wanted to do. We have paused the background. We have paused the spikes. We have created a dead bird object that only restarts the game when we are below the level so we can fall out of it. And this sets us up to be able to then move back to the menu if we want to. We can play some sound effects when the dead bird is created, when we collide with an obstacle, so on and so forth. This is a good setup to be able to then add more features to our game as we go, because we're not done. We're on part 6, but there's actually still quite a few parts left, and that's because there's even more to do. If this is where you want to bug out and just start working on your own project, I totally understand, but I highly encourage you to stick with it. We have a prototype of the game down, and it is, for the most part, playable. There's nothing wrong with it. There's no bugs right now, but there's a lot left to do, and there's a lot more to learn in your game dev journey. So don't stop here. Continue on with me, and let's make a menu, and I'll show you how to write your own functions, how to save and load your game, how to add some difficulty, and even more than that. So thank you for joining me so far. I hope you're enjoying. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, leave them in the description below or find me on Twitter. Thanks so much, and as always, keep making, keep learning, and I'll talk to you later.